Welcome to this video and this new channel. It will be mostly used to talk about stuff that A, wouldn't really fit onto the Snipe and Whip video game channel that I'm part of, and B, is probably of no interest to absolutely anyone but me. So to start off, as I mean to go on, I want to talk about Godzilla and continuity. As someone who likes kaiju movies more than I probably should, I've watched every single film bearing the name Godzilla, and just as every other fan has had to do before and after me, I've had to figure out exactly what the fuck is going on in this series. It's not that it's particularly complex, it's just that it's one of those things that feels more confusing the more you think about it. So I'm going to lay out all of the continuities in this series here, to the best of my understanding anyway, looking at the Japanese films in the series produced by Toho, so no mention of the other stuff unless it becomes relevant. Right, okay, let's do this. The 29 films in the Godzilla series are split into several eras. The first 15 are referred to as the Showa era, after the Japanese emperor at the time, and ran from 1954 to 1975. The second is the Heisei era, once again named after the reigning emperor, which contains 7 films from between 1984 and 1995. There's the 6 Millennium era films from 1999 to 2004, and finally there's the new Reboot era, which so far has only one movie from 2016. The Showa era films are all part of one continuity, with the exception of the movie All Monsters Attack, which appears to take place in the real world as the monster stuff is just part of a kid's imagination, so it's sort of its own continuity. The rest of the films in this era all follow along chronologically from each other, except for Destroy All Monsters, which, despite occurring halfway through the series, is actually the last one in the timeline just to confuse matters. There's also a handful of non-Godzilla stuff that's also part of this canon. The movies introducing both Rodan and Mothra are included, and the TV show Zone Fighter is also canonical since it had many Godzilla monsters appear in it. What isn't canonical are several movies that kinda feel like they should be since they included monsters that were later used in the Godzilla films, like Frankenstein Conquers the World, which introduced the monster Baragon, or Varan with its titular monster. The actual continuity of the Showa series is a bit all over the place, to tell you the truth. After all, this was long before home video, so continuity errors were far more difficult to spot, and in general, people just seem to care less about that sort of thing. My personal favourite bit of continuity oddness is how Godzilla goes from having some weakness to electricity in the first film to being strengthened by it 6 films later in Ebirah Horror of the Deep. As far as I can tell, the reason for this is that originally Horror of the Deep was to star King Kong instead, who in Toho canon is strengthened by electricity. And the reason Kong is strengthened by it is probably only the case because the King Kong vs. Godzilla idea originally involved Frankenstein's monster. Basically, sometimes the monsters gained ability simply because their parts were written for other kaiju and there either wasn't time or anyone giving enough of a shit to fix the script. But anyway, leaving these Showa films behind, next we have the Heisei continuity. These are nice and straightforward. The 7 movies just run all the way through from the return of Godzilla in The Return of Godzilla to his death, spoilers, in Godzilla vs. Destroyer. The only other movie these have in their continuity is the 1954 original. Everything else from the Showa era didn't happen. Although it's also possible that the first 2 films in this era didn't happen either, since the third film, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, introduces some time travel rewriting of history, but we're getting into X-Men Cinematic Universe territory there, and it's probably best to leave it well enough alone. Oh, and interestingly, this era gives us the only numbered sequel in the series, in the West at least, with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, which is neither a sequel nor a remake of the 1974 film, because of course it's not. And then there's the Millennium series. Okay, the 6 Millennium films are essentially an anthology series, with them all having their own continuities outside of 2 that share one. Godzilla 2000 is connected to the original and nothing else. Godzilla vs. Megaguirus is the same, despite having the same distinctive purple-spined, green-skinned Godzilla design as Godzilla 2000, the 2 films are completely unconnected. Next is Godzilla, Mothra and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, which most just call GMK for short. A movie with a terrible, terrible name that's actually quite good. It's my favourite of the era. Once again, the only film it really ties into is the original, but it also references events from the 1998 TriStar Godzilla, pulling that into legitimate Godzilla continuity, if only so it can mock it. Then we have what is sometimes referred to as the Kiryu saga. Kiryu is a version of Mechagodzilla that is built upon the bones of the first Godzilla and had 2 films in the Millennium series, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Godzilla Tokyo SOS. Aside from their connections to the original movie, which is in itself a continuity issue since you can clearly see the first Godzilla's bones disintegrated in that movie, it also has continuity with a bunch of non-Godzilla Toho films from the Showa era as revealed in a tie-in book. The movies in question are Rodan, Varan, Mothra, Gorath, Atragon, Dagora, Frankenstein Conquers the World, War of the Gargantuas, King Kong Escapes, and Space Amoeba. And yes, whilst it's true that the connection for some of these might be a little tenuous, it does make me happy that in one of these damn timelines King Kong Escapes is canon, dumb bloody movie that it is. The last Millennium film was 2004's Godzilla Final Wars. It's a standalone film for the franchise's 50th birthday, and due to that it's almost like a condensed version of the entire series into one movie, stuffed full of old monsters, references, and just being weird. I don't believe there's anything tying it to any other movie explicitly, but due to the nature of it you could argue its connection to any one of about 40 films. And finally, in the Reboot series that hasn't got a catchy name yet, we have only one entry. Shin Godzilla from 2016 has no connections whatsoever to any other movie. It is entirely standalone, and looking at the mess I've made explaining all this, I'm kinda glad they decided to wipe the slate clean. I think it allowed the movie to be something new and interesting since it wasn't tied to all this baggage. So yeah, that's 9 different continuities in the mainline series alone, not even touching on the various comic, TV and American film timelines, or even the variant ones created by the Western re-edits of some of the old films. I'm sure some people will have their own theories about how these movies fit together, but I tried to stick to what seems to be intentional on Toho's part. If you do have other theories, then please let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear them. After all, it requires a fair bit of retconning to make half the official timelines work anyway. Personally, I headcanon none of the Showa films with Manila are canon, because he's terrible. What I will say though is that even if the canon is a garbled mess to pick through, don't let that stop you from trying to watch these movies if you haven't. Honestly, most of the Godzilla films aren't exactly complicated, and very few of them actually require knowledge of the series to enjoy, especially if you're dealing with the older films where continuity is vague at best and thrown out the window at worst. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that if you do choose to watch a Godzilla film, you probably shouldn't ever think about the timelines anywhere near as much as I just have.